Hello, Francis.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to this interview. I will try to present you a little bit. You are a Catholic priest, a scholar and a writer interested in interreligious dialogue and also in Tibetan Buddhism. You teach Tibetan Buddhism at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and you translated several early biographies of Milarepa, which is a Tibetan yogi and a poet, and you studied the rainbow body phenomenon in Tibet. And in this regard, you recently published the French translated and revised version of your book, Rainbow Body and Resurrection, which is titled in French as Corps arc-en-ciel et résurrection, la dissolution du corps dans le Dzogchen et le christianisme ancien. And in this book, you explore in a deeply informed study the rainbow body phenomenon, which is in the Dzogchen tradition, a manifestation of spiritual realization. And also in this book, you raise the fascinating question of whether there is a connection between the rainbow body and the dying and rising of Jesus. And my first question is, how did you, as a Catholic priest, become interested in other traditions such as Dzogchen?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present this new translation in French, which is really a wonderful accomplishment, thanks to our friend Grégoire Angouet and also Philippe Cornu, who encouraged this project. So my own work, of course, I will be 74 in September, so I almost have to apologize for this because at a certain point in life, there are so many influences and so many different experiences that it's difficult to restrict oneself to a few remarks to point out, the background of my interest in these topics. But to make things fairly simple, even more than 50 years ago, when I was a student at Cornell University in upstate New York, I was part of the team that would host the speakers at the weekly university chapel services. And so we hosted a great many spiritual leaders in that very exciting period of time. Right after 1968, the year of so many revolutionary changes. And so we had people like William Sloane Coffin, who was a Protestant minister and theologian and prominent anti-war activist. Daniel Berrigan actually was on staff at the university and was a close friend, leading U.S. anti-war activist. People like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche came. Some of the other Zen masters came. Swami Satchidananda, the founder of Integral Yoga, he was a disciple of Shivananda, actually, in Rishikesh. So this wonderful panoply of remarkable individuals came to Cornell University, and we were their hosts. And that went on for several years. So you can imagine a considerable number of people shared their ideas with us, not only in a public forum, but as a team, we were able to meet with these people before and after the event. And so that certainly stimulated my interest a great deal. There was also a more humble individual whose name was Rick Riali, who was a stereo repairman who encouraged us, in conversations in the coffee house in Annabelle Taylor Hall to read the Evans Wentz translations of the Tibetan classics, like The Life of Milarepa, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines, and so forth. And I became quite fascinated right at that time, particularly with The Life of Milarepa, which struck me as being particularly effective in communicating the ideals of Buddhism, but in a way that was quite different from the texts of early Buddhism that I had read up to that time. So this will give you a bit of an idea. My main spiritual teacher, who was also the inspiration for the book Rainbow Body and Resurrection, is Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was an Austrian who came to America in the late 1940s with his brothers after completing studies in Vienna. And he joined a monastery that was not far from Cornell University, Mount Savior Monastery. And he had begun an active dialogue and study with Zen masters in the United States and had permission from the Vatican to do so. So under his guidance, I not only learned Zen Buddhism, but also learned the values and the way of life of the Benedictine monks. So all of these things combined, and then with a long history, to a long trajectory of activities on my part to try to understand the world religions and eventually get a doctorate in Buddhist studies.
So you are maybe in the Catholic Church reference on these matters, on these notably on the Dzogchen. And could you explain what, from your perspective, what is Dzogchen and who the main figures of this tradition are?
All right, sure. This is a very interesting topic all in itself. Dzogchen, of course, means literally great perfection or great completion. And you will notice that among our colleagues who have both studied and practiced forms of Tibetan Buddhism over the years, many of them have a similar trajectory, I would say. That is, they usually will begin with the study of the philosophical positions of the Gelugpa tradition, which is the predominant perspective of Tibetan Buddhism. This is the largest religious order in classic Tibet and continues to be very influential. And then they will go on from there, receiving many different kinds of teachings and especially empowerments from various Rinpoches, and begin practicing the tantras through the extremely extended non-dro practices, and so on and so forth. As the years go on, you will notice a tendency to seek for both simplicity and radicality. All right, in the practice. And so you will see them going more and more to study with Dzogchen teachers, or to recover some of the lineages that have been handed down through some of the very prominent people who are alive today still teaching this, such as, for example, Chokyi Nyima Rinpoche, who unites Dzogchen with Mahamudra traditions, and others in the Nyingma and also the Bonpo lineages, where there is a very elaborate and brilliantly presented Dzogchen tradition. Now, going back historically, we will notice something similar. All right, now I'm taking a little bit of a risk making this comparison, but in the 8th century, when the Tibetan aristocracy began to embrace Buddhism under the inspiration of the imperial government, you will notice that they imported Madhyamika philosophy, Yogacara philosophy, They imported also tantric Buddhism. So you have Shantarakshita and Kamalashila bringing in the scholastic and monastic Buddhism, and Guru Padmasambhava bringing in the tantric lineages. And already Padmasambhava introduces a more radical, you might say, encounter with the nature of mind prior to any manifestation of thought or phenomena, right? And you begin to discover that, and this is Sam Van Schaik, the great British scholar of the Dunhuang manuscripts. He points out that it seems that there was a need to not only interpret intellectually, but experientially through contemplative practice all of the philosophy and the tantric practices, many of which are quite elaborate, involving expensive mandala displays, lengthy rituals, and very, very demanding kinds of practice. So how do we interpret all of this? And so you go back to the three statements of Garab Dorje, who was the presumable first person in the world to give Dzogchen teachings, and those 3 points enable the practitioner to enter this elaborate world with an appropriate view. Okay, so that one is introduced by the master to the state of contemplative awareness prior to the manifestation of phenomena, that introduction. Very, very important and brilliant. Then there's the removal of doubts. All right, so that through practice, all right, under the guidance of your teacher, there is the removal of the residues of confusion and doubt in the mind, without, of course, attempting to transform that confusion, but to understand it from a prior perspective. And then finally, to abide in that state, right? To remain always in that state of primordial awareness. And it sounds really great when you say it, but it's not easy to do. But it does greatly help one's encounter with elaborate ritual and all of the other things that go on in life. And one can well imagine that the Tibetan people, who at the time, and perhaps even today, can be described as a very active people, a very creative people, and people committed to a wide variety of human activities, that you can see how they would have appreciated this particular cutting through insight, both through the Garab Dorje 3 statements and also through the guidance of Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava. Okay, so you can see, I think that's where it's coming from. Now, of course, as time went on, Dzogchen also underwent some transformations and began to assimilate in the 11th century some of the practices that were coming out of India at that time, which is called the second diffusion of Buddhism in Tibet. And in that period of time, new philosophical perspectives and debates were emerging, new ways of doing the tantric practices also, and you begin to see some challenges. In my book, I tried to talk a little bit about the figure of Milarepa as a kind of an exemplar of this transformation, because in his predicament, being someone who had committed murder through sorcery, he needed to transform his mind stream, having done many intense negative practices. So when he went to the Dzogchen master Laga Tompa, he presented his case, and the master said, "Oh, I'm sure you'll be fine. Meditate in the morning, you'll be a Buddha by night. Meditate at night, by morning you'll be enlightened." And that didn't happen. It didn't happen. The simple approach, the cutting through approach, simply did not work for someone in Milarepa's situation. And so Milarepa eventually found his way to Marpa, whose approach was more, shall we say, rigorous. All right. But that illustrates some of the problems that had to be resolved in the 11th, 12th, 13th century as Tibetans assimilated new ideas and new traditions. And I think it is emblematic of what went on there. But it is also interesting that Dzogchen itself evolved as a result of these challenges. Both Bonpo and and Nyingma traditions evolved, and you get to a figure like Longchenpa in the 14th century, creating a wonderful synthesis of Buddhist philosophy and the Dzogchen teachings. One could mention a great many other people. I think the figure of Nubchen in the 9th century is very interesting. He's a figure associated by Tibetan history with some of the darkest and most negative aspects of esoteric practice. But he also wrote a brilliant book, The Lamp for Contemplative Seeing, which explains how Dzogchen addresses the different challenges that come up in spiritual practice and in philosophical debate. So he was no lightweight by any stretch of the imagination. And that book has recently been, I think, published by Jacob Dalton, if I'm not mistaken, a new translation. So there's a lot of history there, and of course, even Milarepa's own training in magic by both Nyingma and Bonpo masters reflects some of that neither good nor evil. In the decision to distinguish prior awareness from the outward manifestations of good and evil can also lead to some distortions and, of course, some tragedies as well. So that's what the tradition also likes to point out, saying that there was the people who were practicing the tantras literally and in getting involved in ritual murder and ritual sexuality. So all of this goes into the pot and tells us that Tibetan history was definitely very complex and involved in some ways an exclusionary principle, because the imperial lineage preferred, once it had adopted Buddhism, it preferred the Indian version of Buddhism, tended to exclude the Chinese version, but also tended to exclude West Asian traditions. Whereas at the peripheries of the Tibetan Empire, we see the presence of West Asian and Chinese traditions very much present and very active. So you sort of have a kind of a membrane around the Tibetan Empire that is in interaction with the world outside, and the heart of Tibetan civilization that only wants to open out toward India, to the south. It's an interesting biological model of this human experience that we call the Tibetan Empire.
So you have a quite extensive knowledge of what Dzogchen is, and do you, as Catholic priest, have a Dzogchen practice, or do you practice spiritual techniques or methods coming from Dzogchen?
Okay, so in the course of my life and also research, as I mentioned before, my own teacher was a disciple of Japanese Zen masters. Okay, and so I began to do the sitting practice in that tradition as long ago as 1970. All right, so that became part of my understanding of what we call recollection. In French, recueillement. Recueillement. And recueillement is really a fundamental basic awareness, all right? And out of that basic awareness, one engages with action. Okay, so in other words, the Benedictine monk who is living a recollected life is not only sitting in prayer or meditation, but also engaged in various activities in the course of the day, including liturgy, with that same outlook, with that same viewpoint. So on that basis, it's relatively easy to make a connection with the Dzogchen teachings on the contemplative state or rig. All right. So this becomes an opportunity to step back ever so slightly from the action component without separating from the action component, right? You've got your awareness in a state of recollection, which you have become now familiar with, bhavana, the great Sanskrit word for becoming familiar with something, which is really the practice of meditation, right? Becoming familiar with the state we call contemplation, and then applying that with ever how shall we say, more intense and precise union between that state and whatever is going on. Okay, so having had that training with the Zen background and then the Benedictine background, although I never became a Benedictine monk, but I'm a diocesan priest, but I had a lot of training from them. And then over the years, also studied with people like the great Jetsunma Khenpo Rinpoche and the head of the Dzogchen order, the Drukpa order, Gyalwa Drukchen himself from Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, and Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche here in Italy, one of the great Dzogchen teachers, did retreats with him and his community in the 1990s. I translated for the Drukchen when he gave Chakrasamvara initiation at Marigar in Italy, in Tuscany. And that was a wonderful experience because then I'm sitting right next to this tremendous teacher. And I visited Khenpo Rinpoche a number of times in Samtensé, her monastery in Dehradun. So I've had these and many other experiences. Chokyi Nyima Rinpoche has been a dear friend for more than 20 years. Really great friendship between the two of us. So these experiences, Adzom Rinpoche I met at one point thanks to Anne Klein, the wonderful professor of Buddhist studies herself, one who has journeyed through the several schools of Tibetan Buddhism and is now foundress of an important Dzogchen practice center. So there were many people. There was also that Rigzin Ling Center in Northern California, which was founded by Chagdud Rinpoche. The community there was very, very welcoming to me, and I practiced Nondro with them and received many teachings from the lamas there. So over the years, I've accumulated this very, very warm experience of shared knowledge and practice. And so that's been very good. Of course, I did my doctoral work with Alex Wayman, who was one of the great translators, who really was a very, very precise and careful guide, both in our Sanskrit studies and in our Tibetan studies. So he was the man who directed my dissertation on Milarepa and on the saints in Buddhism.
Okay. So quite a rich practice, a rich contemplative practice. But do you consider that in Christianity itself, one can have a contemplative practice without going to other ways, other traditions?
Okay, well, of course, clearly, with the notion of recollection animating the soul of monastic practice in Christianity, we can see that there is this kind of training. Now, in the book Rainbow Body and Resurrection, we have a chapter on the Evagrian trajectory. All right. In French, there's a very, very wonderful book by Antoine Guillamont, Une philosophe au désert, Évagre le Pontique. Now, this book is his crowning glory before he passed away. Guillamont spent an entire life studying this, mostly in Greek fragments and then Syriac translations, all right, the work of Evagrius. But the figure of Evagrius of Pontus, who was living in the second half of the 4th century, all right, in mostly the last part of his life as a desert monk in Nitria in Egypt. This figure presents us with a method of spiritual practice that takes us through various stages. All right, so there's a basic orientation towards contemplative prayer and the cleansing of the mind. All right, and then he goes on to describe the qualities of an authentic teacher. All right. So there's the practicos, the disciplining of the mind, and then there's the gnostikos, the encounter with the spiritual teacher. And then finally there's the great and very difficult work, the Kephalaia Gnostica, all right, which has here been translated by Ilaria Ramelli. I've done my own translation of this, but hers is quite good. There you have what looks like, how shall we say it, 540 very brief paragraphs, all right, organized into 6 chapters. And it is as if the master is to give the disciple 1 or 2 of these per week. And then the disciple goes back to the hermit cell where they live a week and is supposed to, in addition to the prayers and other practices that are done, is supposed to reflect on those particular paragraphs. And then the Saturday night at the end of the week, go back to the master and in a gathering of the hermits, advanced as well as beginners, to share insights. In some ways, it looks a little bit like the Zen koan, doesn't it? You're given a koan, and then you're supposed to meditate intensely on that and share with the master in Dokusan what your insight has been, and then, of course, receive a kind of guidance or evaluation. So this is a kind of interesting practice because it's long before Zen, and it's also long before Dzogchen. Here you have this practice being adopted by the Christian monks in Egypt. And then what we find out is that the Christian monks in the Persian Empire, all right, who are using the Aramaic language, all right, or Syriac as it's called, the Christian version of Aramaic, they sent their monks to Egypt in the 5th century to learn the traditions that had been taught by people like Evagrius. And they brought back the works of Evagrius from Egypt and also Palestine, where they were collected and translated from Greek into Syriac. They brought this back and made their own editions of these works and taught them in the monastery. So what's really beautiful about the Syriac tradition is that in addition to using these sources, some of the mystics in the Syriac Christian tradition left behind letters and sermons in which they explicitly talked about their experiences. All right. And this is what's particularly interesting because, traditionally, Christian monasticism, you're not supposed to talk, much less write about your inner experiences. But these monks sharing among themselves in private correspondence did share some remarkable experiences, including seeing a disk of light, seeing crystalline forms, various phenomena that would appear as they would meditate. They also seem to have had, at least at certain times, the practice of remaining in the cell completely closed, as if in dark retreat. Okay, so that they're having these experiences and they are describing the implications of those experiences. They also reported some of the bodily transformations that they were undergoing. For example, no longer needing to eat, or no longer needing to sleep, or experiencing other phenomena that would be connected with the purification of body and mind. At the same time, we know that Buddhists in Central Asia had been translating some works from Sanskrit describing meditation practices on spheres of light. Right? And so there's a convergence there. And one of the signals that we have a connection with Evagrius is that Evagrius himself describes a sphere of light of the color of sapphire. And that very color, the sapphire blue color, is described in one of the texts that I discovered. It was translated in 1964 into German from Sanskrit, from fragments that were found in Central Asia. And there is a meditation there on sapphire light and other colored lights that come from the Ushnisa on top of the head of the Buddha. Okay, so there is this light mysticism in Syriac Christianity and also in Central Asian Buddhism. Now, what's exciting is the possibility that these traditions actually met.
Mm.
And so the book also goes into the evidence for that encounter. All right. But your question really was about our own practice. I would say this is kind of interesting. The very word contemplation, all right, or contemplative practice, which we use, like say in the Mind and Life in Europe, we very frequently use this expression. But the word is from Latin, and it was developed, it evolved as part of the practice of monastic life in Western Europe. Okay, so it is kind of interesting to see it become a generic word almost overnight with not much reference to its roots. But we have in Western Europe, we have this strange historical situation in that if I look out my window here in southern Italy, I can look out and I can see some places where there were hermits during the course of the centuries, so that anyone who wanted to do deeper contemplative practice, all they had to do was go and get some advice from one of these hermits.
Mm.
Okay, and that was rather common all over Europe. So you had hermits, you had even anchorites, people who not only lived in solitude, but actually were enclosed in a solitary cell and dedicated their lives entirely to prayer. Then you have, of course, the monasteries, large and small, and you have different kinds of monasteries. And we have vast quantities of literature that were produced in these institutions. And then along comes, the 18th century, and a lot of these monasteries were not only, well, first of all, the Reformation in the 16th century, where monasteries in the areas that became Protestant were destroyed, and the monks either became Protestant ministers or they fled or were killed, as happened in England, for example. And then you end up with the revolutions further destroying these institutions, so that the institutions dedicated to this particular aspect of human experience were obliterated almost entirely, all right, in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. So now we have to go and learn from yogis and Tibetan lamas, the things that were down the street, for much of the history of Western civilization. And indeed, there's a kind of hostility to that heritage that persists because of what? Because of the way the Enlightenment decided to present itself. Well, let's face it, shall we say, the nasty side of Voltaire, right? And the nasty side of Cavour and and some of the other Mazzini and Garibaldi here in Italy, the really nasty things that they did. When the monks of Monte Corona, for example, in Umbria, begged Cavour if they could please be left alone because Napoleon had left them alone, right, to be hermits up on top of this mountain. Cavour with sang-froid, shall we say, signed the paper obliterating them, making them illegal, all right, and throwing them out. So this kind of thing went on, and so naturally the negative karma from that also is, there's a kind of a resonance of negativity there that needs to be purified. And perhaps it's being purified now through the many retreat centers of our Buddhist friends in Europe, as if they're healing the wounds that were left by this frenzy to destroy any remnant of the contemplative life.
I propose that we turn to discuss about the book called Arc-en-ciel et Résurrection. First, how did you have the idea to write this book and to make this investigation?
Okay. Yeah, this is very much at the start of the book when, all right, so my teacher, Brother David Steindl-Rast, had been in dialogue with what's called the Jesus Seminar, which were a group mostly of American biblical scholars, also some English and German, who were evaluating statements attributed to Jesus in the New Testament and deciding by consensus which of those statements were most likely rooted in the possible diction, right? The possible statements actually coming from Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. So they were looking for the historical Jesus through the statements that have come down to us in the New Testament and of course elsewhere, and trying to evaluate them and putting together a kind of a scale of probability. All right. And in addition, being committed to historical methods of research, they evaluated the resurrection of Jesus as probably some kind of psychological resurgence of hope among the disciples after the death of Jesus. But it was not a literal, resurrection of Jesus from the tomb and appearing in bodily form to these disciples after his death. So this whole thing, Brother David was involved in a conversation, especially with Marcus Borg, who was one of the leading members of the Jesus Seminar, and said, well, what about the Shroud of Turin? You see, and the Shroud of Turin represents a crucified man, front and back, full length, with the same wounds that we usually attribute to Christ, but many details that are neither in the New Testament nor in most Christian iconography of the crucifixion. All right, there are many interesting details there that would suggest that however this was made, it was not made in continuity, either with a text or with an artistic tradition. So Brother David said, well, what do you think of that? And they said, oh, well, it was probably made in the Middle Ages by somebody as a pious forgery, you see. But as you probably know, if you go online, there are perhaps dozens of websites dedicated to research, some of it, of course, of poor quality, some of it deliberately designed by skeptics, all right, whose business it is to disprove things, but others done by quite serious scientists. That would say, for example, the notorious carbon-14 dating of it being about 800 years old turns out to have been done incorrectly. The methodology was wrong. And so what this throws out the carbon-14 dating and pushes the whole thing back 2,000 years, in which case it would be the burial cloth of Jesus. Now, we can go on at great length about that, but Brother David was quite convinced by the shroud, and his biblical scholar interlocutors were not. So then he said, well, what if we had some other kind of evidence, all right, that would explain how a resurrection is possible, even just as a human phenomenon, quite apart from theological considerations. And so in that context, back in 1999, Vanja Palmers, who was a Zen teacher in Switzerland, and a dear friend of Brother David for many, many years, was in conversation with Dr. Schitzegang, I think his name is, who is a psychiatrist working in Zurich. And he said, well, in my home county in eastern Tibet, there's just been the death of this Khenpo Ache, and this was in 1998. They said, and his body disappeared within 8 days of his death. So Vanja reported this to Brother David, and Brother David told me, well, since you know Tibetan, Vanja is willing to fund some research, and perhaps you can organize a team and go over there and interview the eyewitnesses. And so that's basically how it happened. So I was able to get some financial support in addition to that of Vanja Palmers, and was able to bring a couple of friends along, including Douglas Duckworth, who is a very talented Tibetan translator. and some other people. And we had some remarkable experiences, which are described in the book,
Mhm.
as we did this research, interviewing people, but also experiencing the environment and the spirituality that pervades even, the region now known as Sichuan, the eastern portion of Tibet, where, in spite of the many challenges of the past 75 years, people have kept their Buddhist practice remarkably intact.
It's an investigation about Kenpo Echo,
Mm.
and can you tell us about his who was Kenpo Echo and uh, what was his realization, his rainbow body realization?
All right. The Khenpo led a very interesting life. He was probably born around 1918. All right. And he grew up in a small village where he ended up also passing away. This little tiny village, Lomaga, in eastern Tibet, or what is called Kham in traditional Tibetan geography. It's now the western part of Sichuan province in China. And this is in Nyarong County, which was a very important place for the particular culture of the Kampa tradition in eastern Tibet. So he grew up really in a Nyingma village and ordained as a monk in the Nyingma tradition
Mm.
as a young man. But at a certain point, he decided to go to Lhasa to study the dialectical philosophy with the great teachers of the Gelugpa order. There is a Gelug monastery not far from his village in the town of Kanza, and we visited that monastery and interviewed people there. And what happened is he went there, and for some reason, and this is not clear, he also ordained with the Gelugpa order.
Mhm.
So he was a Nyingma monk, and then he became a Gelug monk. All right. Then he came back to his home village, having completed his studies. But along the way, he met Dudjom Rinpoche and received a Vajrakilaya empowerment. Apparently, this event was of great importance because he was treated as someone that Dudjom Rinpoche could foresee, all right, would attain high realization.
Mm.
Okay, and so in the course of the ritual, there were certain designations about that. Now, there are other biographies, one of them by a close Nyingma disciple of Khenpo Ache, which may give us more detail if we can ever get our hands on that biography, more detail on the perhaps retreat practice that Khenpo Ache did to realize the potential he received through that empowerment of Vajrakilaya. But in any case, that was a very important turning point in his life. And then he returns to his home village and begins teaching. He's teaching in a Nyingma style, but he's also
Mm.
teaching in a Gelug style. And this is probably in the late 1940s and in the course of the early 1950s, up until the time the Kampas rebel against the communist Chinese. In that period of time, of course, there was open warfare, and the Khenpo had to kind of go into hiding. But instead of hiding himself completely, he would go around quietly and continue giving teaching. And he became known really as a great reconciler, a great saint, a man of immense compassion. In spite of the fact that there were some villagers who criticized him because they were afraid with his Gelugpa identity, he
Mm.
would try to change the Nyingma monastery into a Gelug monastery. This is a phenomenon that had been repeated a number of times in eastern Tibet, causing a great deal of unhappiness. All right. But the genius and the beauty of Khenpo Ache and his story is that he did not practice in that way. He maintained very warm relationships with the monks at the Gelug Monastery in Kanza, and he maintained the traditions and respect for the practices of the Nyingma lineage in his home village. In other words, he was able to integrate the two and, as it were, wear a red hat and a yellow hat, as the case may be. And he was very much beloved by his nun disciples across the river from Kanza. And in fact, after our visit to the Gelug Monastery, where we received 8 chapters of the biography, the 9th chapter, describing his death and attainment of the rainbow body, was held by the nuns. So we went over there and we asked them if they would give us a copy of the 9th chapter. And they all sat around us and we were discussing this, and they brought out the chapter, and I read part of it aloud, and there were the words that mean faith and devotion. And I said to the nuns, well, this is really what it's all about. This is the foundation, isn't it? And one by one, they began to allow tears to come down from their eyes, down their cheeks. You know, it was really an incredible moment when we realized how deeply they loved this Khenpo and how much he meant to them. And that seemed what mattered most was faith and devotion, and not so much exterior manifestations of realization, you know. But we did eventually get to his hermitage. We interviewed disciples and relatives there, and it was really very powerful experience to go there and feel the energy that was still in the air. Only 2 years, excuse me, 2 years after the event. So that's the story. But you know, when he died in this little hermitage. As he's breathing his last, he's saying the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, Om Mani Padme Hum, right? And then he fades into death, and his face changes from an 82-year-old man to the smoothness and vitality of a small child. Right? So they knew something was going to happen. And already there had been mysterious rainbows in the sky, even before his death. And so they consulted with his Dharma brother, Lama Akyum, all right, who was about 100 kilometers away. And he said, just leave the body under the cloth and continue your prayers and the appropriate rituals. And then you will see when the right moment comes. After 8 days, remove the cloth. And they noticed that the body was shrinking under the cloth. And there were lights in the sky, rainbows, a very large, almost like an explosion of light at one point, and also perfume and mysterious music that manifested while all this was going on. So they all report this pretty consistently. So that was they removed the cloth, and there was nothing there. There was nothing there. Some reports have said hair and nails, but there was no hair and no nails. Okay, it was completely gone.
This is the rainbow body phenomenon?
I think we can say that that is an example of rainbow body. Yes.
Yes, because there's other examples or other ways that it can manifest.
Yes, and this can get very technical, which I think it could take us 2 hours to explain. But there are, for example, you do see people who leave behind hair and nails, all right? And then in the case of the Dharma brother, who assured us that he too would attain rainbow body at the time of death, when he died, about, I would say, 8 to 10 years after our interview, he left behind a shrunken body. Okay. And that has been part of the relic tour, where there have been some Buddhist relics that have been presented since 2010 in different parts of the world, which have excited considerable interest. There are other examples of the shrunken body. I believe it was Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche who left behind a shrunken body in Kathmandu near Bodhanath, where his stupa is now to this day venerated. So that the idea here, though, to make it very simple, a complex thing quite simple, is that if normally when a master passes away, All right, they wait a considerable amount of time, as long as 49 days before cremation. So the body is preserved using camphor and salt in a special box until the auspicious day for the cremation arrives. At which point, of course, they look for signs in the sky during the cremation, such as rainbows. And also after the cremation, they go through the ashes to find symbolic objects like ring cell, little spheres, colored spheres, or bone fragments that may contain a symbolic object like a sacred letter. Okay, this kind of thing. Now, the importance of relics, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, we know that relics were extremely important, even for very early Buddhism. That's why the stupas were built. But for Tibetan Buddhism, it is to maintain a necessary connection with one's spiritual teacher. In other words, it's part of Guru Yoga. And Guru Yoga is considered to be the foundation, the faith and devotion, right? The faith and devotion that allows a person to make spiritual progress, right, is through the grace of the teacher, right? So if you have disciples, they want relics after you die, okay? And so this is why most masters who have numerous disciples will leave behind relics in one way or another. This is one of the I might say, mysterious qualities of the death of Khenpo Acha, who did not leave relics, okay, and yet had many disciples. But what he did was, of course, they now have the monastic robe in a shrine in the village of Lomaga, all right, and that is the object of devotion. But it is kind of interesting that of all of these cases of masters who had disciples, he's the one who didn't leave behind relics. But it's a sort of the exception that proves the rule, all right?
During this investigation, did you encounter resistance or challenges or difficulties, maybe from the monks or from methodological issues?
Okay, well, one of the interesting things that we discovered was that and remember, we're talking a very warm relationship, a very, I would say, truly loving relationship between the Khenpo and his Gelugpa brothers in the Great Gompa in Kanza. So we did not encounter any kind of negativity. They simply would not address the question of a rainbow body. Okay, the symbolic meaning of having 8 chapters of the biography with the 9th chapter across the river, I think illustrates the approach. Also, in our conversation with one of the Rinpoches of that monastery, who was a very dear friend of the Khenpos, he describes the experience a year before the death of the Khenpo, doing mo, the divination procedure that you use a mala and you count the number of beads between your hands on the mala, and then that number is looked up in a book to see whether circumstances are auspicious or not auspicious or what to do. And when they did this divination, they set aside the mala and they set aside the book, and by spontaneous inspiration, the Rinpoche said, perhaps you should have a tanka painted, a scroll painting made of the Tushita heaven, right? The heaven from which Buddha Shakyamuni descended to earth, okay? And that ritual of the production of a sacred painting would purify you of the final trace of impurity that still burdens your conscience, okay? And so that was the story there. That was what they understood was going on in the last year of the Khenpo's life. Through the painting of that tanka, complete purification, okay? But they would not discuss the rainbow body, whereas the Nyingma friends and relatives and disciples were happy to talk about the rainbow body.
Mm.
Okay.
And
And this goes into, in a certain point in the book where I quote the great Bonpo scholar in Paris, Samten Karme, who says quite explicitly, the rainbow body is not part of Buddhism.
mm.
Okay. All right. It is kind of unorthodox. It is kind of on the margins. And that also allows us to ask some questions about possible other influences.
So it's the Dzogchen practice that leads to rainbow body in the tradition. I That's what
Yes.
I
So,
understood.
the people practicing now at the present time
Mhm.
would assert that through practices, whether through the Bunpo lineages or the Nyingma lineages, you will be able to attain the rainbow body, the attainment of such a profound state of primordial awareness,
Mm.
moment to moment, uninterruptedly, that your entire body returns to its origin, all right, after death. And the manifestation would take the form of these lights that one may see and other phenomena. So this this even in Tibetan history, there is the legendary story of the kings who would ascend to heaven on a rope, all right, and they would disappear, all right, or other beings who would disappear into rainbows, all right. So this is already part of the cultural background. And it seems that in spite of the claims of some authors we respect, but who are not relying on historical materials, it does seem that actual manifestations of a disappearance of the body cannot be verified, all
Mm.
right, before the 11th century. All right. So this also brings us into some interesting territory because we begin to see reports that someone was able to dissolve their body starting roughly in the 11th century, which is also about the time that we get the first tertons, all
Mm.
right, people who discovered the hidden texts and objects. And it is also the time of conflict between the new tantras coming into Tibet from India and the old schools of Bonpo and Nyingma who are being challenged by that. All right, so it's a time in which there is a kind of a culture war going on. And that's why we have the biography of Garab Dorje being written at the beginning of the 11th century. All right, just the very time that the Dunhuang caves are being closed off.
Mm.
Right. So there's this very important 11th century in which a lot of things are happening and challenges are being met by some new ways of thinking on the part of the older orders in Tibet. And so that's why we see that biography of Gadab Dorje as such an interesting manifestation, because what did I find is that already Eva Darge had pointed out that it sounds like the life of Jesus and Mary, all right?
Mm.
But she didn't go any farther with that. But then if you actually sit down with the Tibetan text and you go through it line by line, you can compare it with, believe it or not, the 19th surah of the Quran.
Mm.
Because there you have the story of Jesus and Mary in the particular redaction of the Muslims. Okay. And there are many points of contact between the Muslim account of of Mary's pregnancy, her being in retreat, her being kind of remote from her family, this mysterious figure, angelic figure who comes, and then the child is very miraculous and does amazing things right from the time of birth and all that. All of these things are in the 19th surah of the Quran, but they're not really in the New Testament. All
Mm.
right. There is the visit of the angel Gabriel and all of that, but not all this other elaborate stuff. And yet, in the life of Garab Dorje, you have the same story as it is told, or at least very close to the way it's told in the Quran. So clearly, somebody has translated from Arabic into Tibetan,
Mm.
but then added on elaborations that bring it more into the sphere of Central Asian and Tantric Buddhism. Okay. And then I think the real genius of the text is that it illustrates through the reading of the text, all right, through the rhythm of the text itself, the way the mind works in meditation.
Mm.
All right. It's a text intimately connecting awareness, primordial state, and the elaborations of the mind that go on in life. All right. And it's really, really a brilliant presentation of that. In other words, it's not really a coherent and logical sequence of events, a chronological kind of text, but it reflects more the way our minds work and the way it is possible to be enlightened in the midst of sheer chaos.
Mm.
All right. Which makes it truly a remarkable work of literature, illustrating the principles of Dzogchen in a narrative form.
You talked about the links between Dzogchen and other traditions. And your book talks about the link, the connection between the realization of the rainbow body and the resurrection of Christ. Could you talk about this point? Because it's really fascinating, I think.
Yeah, one of the things that seems to have, of course, these are all threads, of an argument. So it's not, A equals B equals C kind of thing. All right. But what I did is I interpreted, and not too many people have understood this. So maybe it's good for us to you have the oral tradition here. Quite clearly, from the point of view anyway of anthropology, right? How are ideas exchanged among cultures? Usually through narratives, right? The sharing of stories. And as stories are shared from one culture to another, things are added on, things are absorbed, things are transformed. So, for example, we have the story of Barlam and Yoasaf, who are two Christian saints whose life was written probably about the same time, the early 11th century, as the life of Garab Dorje. But that story has been passed from the story of Shakyamuni in India through to the Manichees, probably through some Buddhist groups, certainly through other cultures that we don't even know about, till it finally reaches Mount Athos and Byzantium, and then it becomes a worldwide bestseller. All right, it's even translated into Hebrew and Persian and so forth. So the story, went through many exchanges. All right, from one culture to another, and many translations. Similarly, this Quranic story of the 19th Surah, with additional pieces coming from the Eastern Christian tradition, ends up getting woven into this tantric story of Garab Dorje. All right, so you see that the influences take the form of shared narratives and evolving narratives. All right, that add on one culture after another. So what's some evidence for contact? Well, in the first place, we do have some evidence from the discoveries in Central Asia at Dunhuang and other places of manuscripts, for example, that on one side of the page, you have a Taoist or Buddhist text, and on the other side of the page, you have a Christian text. Okay. We also know that at Dunhuang, and this is magnificent. It's on the French Dunhuang website, and it's Paleo 351, which is a Mo text, or a divination text, with about 112 or 114 paragraphs. And when you throw the mala in the air and you grab it with two hands, the number of beads between your hands is the number you should look up in the book. All right, so I think it's number 12. And number 12 talks about Isu Messiah, or Messihi, right? Jesus the Messiah, who is sitting at the right hand of the Father, and is this and that and the other thing, and is a friend of mankind, just like Shakyamuni and Chanadorje, all right, Vajrapani, right? So whoever wrote that, knew not just that there was a Jesus, but even knew a bit of the Christian creed, all right, as well as being involved in Buddhism. So in the very same paragraph, you have Christianity and Buddhism, all right, presented in quite explicit terms. And then at the end it says, the outcome will be good.
Mm.
So this is one of the good things if you're doing a divination. So it's quite remarkable because here you have a kind of pragmatic Buddhism, all right? The Buddhism that is practiced in the villages to help people from day to day with their lives, including a reference to the apparently well-known figure of Jesus Christ, all right? Someone who would have been known only at Dunhuang, only through the influence of the Syriac Christians from the Middle East who also had churches in South India. So this was probably the largest church in the world at that time, okay? Because they had communities all through the Persian Empire, in India, Central Asia, and as far east as China. And the other thing that we found at Dunhuang is the wonderful text called The Realization of Profound Peace and Joy by a Syriac monk and what's called a core episcopus, a kind of archpriest, you might say, named Jingjing, who was living in the capital. And we know that Jingjing was a friend of a Buddhist monk from Balkh, which is in modern-day Afghanistan, who had studied at Nalanda, who had been in Sri Lanka, who had translated many texts and brought those texts with him to China. And with Jingjing, he learned Chinese from a Christian, right? And translated a text, the Mahayana Sutra, on the six paramitas, okay? Now, they got criticized for doing this. They were bold and daring. They did this. But the beauty of it is that the outcome was that Prajna learned Chinese so well, all right, from Jingjing, that he eventually became head of the Chinese Imperial Translation Bureau that did all those translations from Sanskrit into Chinese, all right? And now we're talking about the 8th century. So this is pretty remarkable. He translated important parts of the Huayan Sutra, the Avatamsaka, Flower Garland Sutra, which is quite an important text for cosmology and for Buddhist realization from the Bodhisattva point of view. So anyway, Jingjing wrote a text in which he presents Jesus explaining to St. Peter in a great assembly, just like a Buddhist sutra, the meaning of Buddhist terms as they should be understood by Christians in China. And this is written in classical Tang Dynasty Chinese and very elegant, on elegant paper. It was clearly a luxury work. Calligraphy and so forth, so that it was, not just a marginal kind of thing. This was really important. And it turns out that the same author is the author of the famous Stele of 781. This is a monument that was found in 1623 in China, at the site of the old imperial capital, and which was translated at that time for the first time into Western languages, which tells the history of the Christians in China from 641 to 781, okay? The idea was to remind the Chinese public that the Christian church in China had been legitimated by every Tang Dynasty emperor. And so that, that they were, welcome and could continue doing their work. So here we have, in the very same time period as the transmission of important Tantric and Mahayana works to China, we also have the same period of time, Buddhism becoming the state religion of Tibet. We have at Dunhuang evidence for intimate contact between Christians, Buddhists, and Taoists, right? So that we're beginning to see that at the peripheries of the Tibetan Empire, there is an exchange of ideas going on, in which it would be possible to imagine that someone would have talked about Jesus having risen from the dead, all right? And seated at the right hand of the Father, and so on and so forth. So all of these doctrinal statements are woven into narrative texts, all right, that were shared among Taoist Christians and Buddhists. So Dzogchen is evolving in Tibet as part of the assimilation of Indian Buddhism, right, as a way of practical assimilation, practical interpretation of how to live those texts, all right? It's not exactly in that same period that the Christianity filters into central Tibet because it was prohibited. The Manichaees were explicitly prohibited, and anything from Western Asia was excluded from central Tibet. But over the next couple of centuries, when there is political chaos, disintegration of the empire, and so on, these ideas begin to flow once again more freely. All right, and then we probably have by the 11th century the willingness of some Buddhists to say, you know, that level of realization, the dissolution of the body, is beginning to speak to us in new ways. Because, you know, also in India, there are claims of the dissolution of the body through yogic practice. There are the texts in South India about the meditation on the syllable Om at the heart chakra, bringing solar energy into the body, which then extends out into the whole body. And so it becomes an idea and a practice that a number of people, remember the South Indian yogis and China have an intimate connection. There's a lot of evidence for that. So that this discussion of the possibility and then Taoist immortality, right? So there's a lot of discussion going on transformation of the body, dissolution of the body, and finally light as a metaphysical principle. And so what we begin to see is that somebody, we don't know who, began to realize that meditation on light in a certain way could bring about bodily transformation, just like the Syriac monks had experienced previously, but could go farther toward shrinkage and dissolution. Okay. And of course, now the next story will be who was that and when? But my guess is 11th, 12th century. Because we already have evidence that Milarepa could dissolve his body at the time of death in a different way, but in the 12th century. Excuse me, 12th century, right? So this is something that evolves with time. It becomes persuasive, at least for some people, if not for everybody, within the Tibetan world.
Your book is really, really detailed. And there's a lot of sometimes difficult information. There's for the newbie like me. It's really rich to see that the contemplative practices are so developed. And I wanted to say that your book is a really very original one and very fascinating one.
By the way, here is something I found in Paris when I was just there at the start of May. Le Monde Syriaque of Françoise Bequet-Chatonin and Muriel Debier. And in here, there's a lot of information about the world that we're describing. It's a beautifully done volume, and it brings us up even to the present day on that world. So these are resources that people can place alongside the Rainbow Body book in French. I'm really grateful, that people have begun to be interested in this. Another example of the offspins of my book is this book, Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus. Allison is a well-known Protestant biblical scholar, and this rather large volume does take quite seriously what I'm trying to say in Rainbow Body and Resurrection, and tries to show that although we can't nail down historical evidence for a bodily resurrection, we can certainly nail down a good deal of information about how a resurrection might have occurred, all right, and how it might have been perceived by people at the time, of Jesus's death. There's a very interesting argument here, and he does use the rainbow body and other paranormal phenomena as a way of saying this is a human experience that is credible and has been repeated a number of times, and that should help us to open our imagination to different, a different way of seeing the human experience.
Thank you really for this exchange, and we are reaching the end of this interview, and I will try to upload the video normally in a few weeks,
Very good.
but I have to do the subtitles and the translation in French, and I'm not so fast. So it could be in 3 or 4 weeks. But in the meantime, I'm really, really thankful for this interview, and I hope that it will interest a lot of people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ludovic.
And have a good day.
You too. Many
Bye.
blessings. Bye bye
Bye.
now.